The rain fell in thin silver needles, stitching the gray sky to the glistening blacktop of the empty road. For 17-year-old Maya, each drop felt like a tiny, cold accusation. Her worn sneakers slapped against the wet pavement, the sound swallowed by the relentless hiss of the downpour. The straps of her backpack, heavy with books she hadn't been able to focus on, dug into her shoulders. She pulled the thin hood of her jacket tighter, a useless shield against the creeping chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of being watched. Headlights bloomed behind her, two perfect circles of brilliant white that bled into the misty air. They didn't pass. They slowed, matching her hurried pace. A low, familiar hum vibrated through the soles of her shoes. The engine of a well-maintained sedan. His car. She didn't need to look. She knew the pristine dark blue finish, the faint pine-scented air freshener that always made her feel sick, the quiet way the electric window would descend. Maya? The voice was smooth, practiced, a cascade of false concern that slid over her skin and made her want to claw it off. Mr. Harrison, her guidance counselor, her mentor, her shadow. "Don't be ridiculous, get in the car," he called, his tone light, as if chiding a silly child. "You'll catch your death out here." She kept walking, her gaze fixed on the distant, blurry glow of a gas station sign about a quarter of a mile ahead. It was a tiny island of light in the overwhelming twilight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her breath hitched. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical pressure against the back of her neck. The car crawled beside her, a patient predator. "I'm just trying to make sure you get home safe," he said, the window now fully down. The cloying scent of pine and cheap leather upholstery wafted out, mixing with the clean smell of the rain. It was a combination she would forever associate with fear. "Your foster mom would be worried sick if she knew you were walking home in this weather." He was using her life against her, wielding her isolation as a tool. He knew her foster parents were too busy, too detached to notice what time she got home. He knew she had no one to call. He had made sure of it, carefully, methodically, over months of feigned kindness and suffocating attention. He was the only one who cared. That was his story, that was his power. "I like the rain," she managed to say, her voice small and tight. A soft, condescending chuckle. "Don't be dramatic, Maya. We need to talk about that history paper. Your grades are slipping. I'm worried about you." The gas station sign flickered, its neon red bleeding into the wet air. It seemed impossibly far. She could see shapes parked beneath the overhang. Large, dark shapes. Motorcycles. A knot of dread twisted in her stomach, competing with the fear of the man in the car. But it was a different kind of dread. The men on the bikes were an unknown danger. Mr. Harrison was a known one. He sighed, a sound of theatrical frustration. "All right, that's enough. I'm not leaving you out here. I'm responsible for you." The car door clicked open. That was it. The sound that broke her paralysis. Her feet, clumsy and cold, found their rhythm. She broke into a run, a desperate, lung-burning sprint toward the light. The backpack bounced wildly against her spine. The wet pavement splashed up her jeans. She didn't look back. She could hear his footsteps behind her, faster than hers, closing the distance. She could hear him calling her name, the concern in his voice now sharpened with an edge of anger. The gas station grew closer, resolving into focus. The bright, sterile light of the convenience store. The dark, hulking forms of at least half a dozen large motorcycles. And the men who owned them, standing in a loose circle, their dark leather vests absorbing the light. They looked like statues carved from shadow and steel. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed. but the fear of his hand on her shoulder, of his voice in her ear, was a more potent fuel. She burst from the rainy darkness into the bright, concrete haven of the station, gasping for air, her vision swimming. The men turned their heads as one, their conversation ceasing. In that single, silent moment, she saw not menace, but stillness, a profound and unwavering calm. Mr. Harrison's car screeched to a halt at the edge of the lot, its headlights pinning her like a terrified animal. She had a choice to make, in the space of a single, ragged breath. The smiling monster she knew, or the silent strangers she didn't. She ran toward the strangers. The world that had deposited Maya on this rainy roadside had been chipping away at her for 2 years, ever since the night of screeching tires and shattering glass. Before that night, life had been a predictable landscape of parental love, homework, and arguments over curfew. Her father had smelled of sawdust and coffee, her mother of lavender soap and the library books she was always reading. Their absence was not a hole, but a crater, a vast and silent space where the entire world used to be. The aftermath was a blur of hushed voices, sterile hospital rooms, and the sympathetic yet distant faces of social workers. She became a case file, a tragic story told in paperwork, passed from one set of hands to another. Her first placement was with a kind but elderly couple who couldn't keep up with the quiet, intense grief of a 15-year-old. The second was a chaotic home with 3 other foster kids, where she learned to make herself smaller, to take up less space, to expect nothing. She became a ghost in hallways, a silent observer in classrooms, her own sorrow a wall between her and the rest of the world. 6 months ago, she had landed here in this small, unremarkable town with the Millers. They weren't unkind, but they were exhausted, worn down by their own lives, and they treated her with a sort of benign neglect. They provided a room, food, and a signature on school forms. Emotional connection was not part of the arrangement. It was into this vacuum that Mr. Harrison had stepped. As the guidance counselor at Northwood High, he was assigned to be her academic and emotional support liaison. In the beginning, he was a lifeline. He noticed her. He asked about her classes, praised her artwork, and spoke to her not as a problem to be managed, but as a person with potential. He told her she was resilient, that she was strong. For the first time in 2 years, someone was seeing her, and she clung to that feeling like a drowning person to a piece of driftwood. The change was gradual, insidious. The weekly check-ins at his office began to run long, the door always slightly ajar at first, then clicking shut. "For privacy," he'd say with a reassuring smile. He started texting her in the evenings, ostensibly about homework, but the messages would drift. "Feeling okay tonight? I was thinking about our conversation today. You're a very special young woman, Maya." He insisted she eat lunch in his office, away from the frivolous drama of the cafeteria, effectively isolating her from the tentative friendships she was trying to build. He framed it all as protection, as special attention for a student who deserved it. Then came the gifts, a book of poetry, a set of expensive drawing pencils. "Just a little something to encourage your talent," he'd say, waving away her discomfort. He began to critique her friends, her clothes, her choices. He was sculpting her reality, chipping away at her confidence until he was the only source of validation she had left. When she tried to pull back, to spend more time with others, he would become wounded, his voice laced with disappointment. "I thought we had a special connection, Maya. I'm just trying to help you. After all you've been through, you need someone firmly in your corner." The final violation had happened 3 days ago. He had discovered her private journal during a random locker search he was supervising. It was a cheap, spiral-bound notebook where she poured out her grief, her loneliness, her growing unease about him. He hadn't returned it. "This contains some worrying thoughts, Maya," he'd said yesterday, his face a mask of professional concern. "I think it's best if I hold on to it for a while. We can work through these feelings together." He had stolen her voice, her last private space, and was now holding it hostage. That was when the fear had finally crystallized into a single, sharp point. She knew, with chilling certainty, that she had to get away. She had started planning, trying to figure out who she could tell, how she could explain the suffocating web he had woven without sounding like a crazy, ungrateful teenager. But he had sensed the shift in her, the new steel in her spine. His watchfulness had intensified, and tonight, when he had seen her walking home, his patience had apparently run out. Now, running toward the silent men at the gas station, she wasn't just fleeing him, she was fleeing the entire system that had failed her, the world that had left her so utterly alone that a man like him could see her as an opportunity. The men of the Warden's motorcycle club were not what most people pictured when they heard the term biker gang. They were a brotherhood, forged not in lawlessness, but in a shared understanding of a world that often failed to protect its own. They operated by a strict, unspoken code, and the first tenet of that code was simple: you don't let the wolves get the sheep. They were on a quiet run back from the coast, a 3-day journey to clear their heads and reaffirm the bonds that held them together. This gas station was just a routine stop for fuel and coffee, a moment of stillness before the final leg home. Their leader, a man in his mid-50s known only as Cutter, was the club's anchor. He stood slightly apart, methodically cleaning his glasses with a soft cloth. His salt-and-pepper hair was cut short, military style, and his face was a roadmap of hard-won experience. A faded tattoo of an eagle, globe, and anchor on his forearm was the only visible clue to his 20 years in the Marine Corps. He had seen the worst of humanity in far-flung places, and had come home to find a different kind of chaos. He founded the Wardens not as an escape, but as a way to impose a small pocket of order on a disorderly world. He moved with an economy of motion, and spoke with a quiet authority that required no volume to command respect. Leaning against a fuel pump was Ghost. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with a lean build and watchful eyes that missed nothing. He was the club's strategist and tech expert. By day, he was a paralegal for a public defender's office, a job that exposed him to the myriad ways the justice system could be bent and broken. He had joined the Wardens after Cutter had helped his sister escape an abusive marriage, a situation the police had dismissed as a domestic dispute. Ghost understood that true justice often required intervention long before a courtroom was involved. In his saddlebag, beneath a waterproof liner, was not a weapon, but a well-worn copy of the state's criminal code. Then there was Bear, a mountain of a man with a wild, dark beard and hands the size of dinner plates. He was the club's mechanic, a savant who could diagnose an engine's ailment by sound alone. His immense size was deceiving. He possessed a gentle, quiet nature. Earlier at the stop, a small boy had tripped and dropped his ice cream cone, his face crumpling in preparation for tears. Without a word, Bear had walked into the store, bought a new cone, and knelt down to give it to the child, his huge tattooed hand surprisingly delicate. He had a daughter of his own and carried a deep paternal instinct to mend what was broken, be it a faulty carburetor or a small child's fleeting sadness. These men, and the handful of others with them, were bound by a shared past of service, disillusionment, and a fierce loyalty to one another. Their leather vests, their cuts, were not symbols of rebellion, but of commitment. The patch on their backs depicted a stylized Viking shield surrounding a solitary lighthouse. a beacon for those lost in the storm. They didn't seek trouble, but they refused to turn their backs when it found someone else. They were disciplined, their bikes were immaculate, and their presence was a silent promise. They were waiting for their tanks to fill, for the coffee to cool, when a frantic, terrified girl burst from the rainy darkness, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it silenced the world around them. They had seen that look before, in war zones, in broken homes, in the eyes of the forgotten, and their code demanded they answer it. Maya stumbled into the bright, buzzing light of the gas station, her chest heaving. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the coolers inside the store, the rhythmic ticking of a cooling motorcycle engine, the soft murmur of the men's voices. It all went quiet. Every eye was on her. She saw their faces, weathered and serious, framed by beards and long hair, their forms solid and imposing in their heavy leather vests. For a terrifying second, she thought she had made a terrible mistake, trading one cage for another. Then her eyes met Cutter's. He wasn't looking at her with pity or suspicion, but with a calm, appraising focus. It was the gaze of a man who was not shocked, who was simply assessing a situation. In his eyes, she saw a steady, unshakable strength that felt more reliable than any comforting word she had ever been offered. Behind her, she heard a car door slam. Mr. Harrison was out of his car, his composure back in place, a mask of paternal concern firmly fixed on his face. He started walking toward her, his hands held out in a placating gesture. "Maya, stop this. You're making a scene," he said, his voice low and urgent, meant only for her, but carrying in the still air. That was the final push. She closed the last few feet between herself and the circle of men, stopping directly in front of Cutter. Her voice was a raw, broken thing, barely a whisper but sharp with desperation. "Please," she gasped, looking up at the stoic man, "he won't leave me alone." Cutter didn't react, didn't move. He simply held her gaze, letting her feel seen. The other men shifted slightly, not in an aggressive way, but like a forest of ancient trees repositioning their roots, subtly forming a barrier. Bear straightened up from his bike, his sheer size an immediate and formidable obstacle. Ghost pushed off the gas pump, his posture casual but his attention fully locked on Harrison. Harrison stopped about 10 feet away, his smile tightening at the edges. "Gentlemen, I'm sorry to bother you. There's just been a small misunderstanding. This is one of my students. She's having a difficult time. I'm her school counselor just trying to get her home." He was good. His voice was reasonable, his demeanor professional. He was painting a picture of a troubled girl and a caring authority figure. To any casual observer, he would be the hero of this story. Cutter's voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a riverbed. He didn't look at Harrison. He kept his eyes on Maya. "The lady said you won't leave her alone." It was a simple statement. He wasn't accusing. He was validating. He was repeating her truth, giving it weight. Harrison's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "She's overwrought. She's not thinking clearly. I have a responsibility to see to her welfare." Maya's mind was racing, a chaotic storm of fear and adrenaline. She knew how this looked. She knew how easily her words could be dismissed. She needed something more, something concrete, something he couldn't explain away. The image of her journal, locked in his briefcase, flashed in her mind. Her stolen voice. Her own voice came out stronger now, fueled by a surge of righteous anger. She looked directly at Cutter, her words clear and precise. "He has my journal. He took it from my locker 3 days ago. It's in his briefcase, in his car." The air crackled. This was the key. It was no longer a vague accusation of harassment. It was a specific claim of theft. It was tangible. It was evidence. Ghost took a step forward, his eyes, dark and intelligent, fixing on Harrison. "Her journal?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. Harrison's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine panic. He had underestimated her. He had assumed her fear would keep her silent and vague. He sputtered, trying to regain control. That's a confidential matter between a student and her counselor. I confiscated it because it contained some alarming content. It's school property for her own protection." The lie was flimsy, and everyone there knew it. The power dynamic had shifted palpably. The space between Harrison and the bikers was now a chasm. He was no longer the authority figure. He was a cornered man, his polished veneer cracking under the silent, unwavering pressure of men who had seen 1,000 liars just like him. The standoff hung in the damp air, thick and heavy. Mr. Harrison stood frozen, his smile a grotesque parody of concern. The wardens formed a silent, immovable bulwark around Maya. They didn't need to threaten. Their presence was the threat, a calm, absolute refusal to yield. Cutter hadn't moved a muscle. His gaze still locked on Harrison, dissecting him layer by layer. "She seems to want it back," Cutter said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was a simple observation, yet it carried the weight of a verdict. Harrison's composure began to fray, completely. A sheen of sweat appeared on his upper lip, mingling with the fine mist of rain. "This is ridiculous. I am a respected educator. You are interfering with a school matter. If you don't disperse, I will call the police." He reached for his phone, a desperate attempt to reclaim authority by invoking a higher power. "No need," Ghost said, his own phone already in his hand. "I'll do it." Before Harrison could react, Ghost was speaking calmly to a 911 dispatcher. "Yes, we're at the Quick Stop on Route 7. We have a minor who is reporting harassment and theft by an adult male. We'd like an officer to come and take a statement." He gave the address and a description of the situation with the cool efficiency of someone who had done it 100 times before. Harrison's face went pale. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had expected the bikers to be intimidated, to back off. He had expected to herd Maya back into his car with a mix of threats and feigned sympathy. He had not expected this calm, methodical escalation. The situation was spiraling out of his control. "Now, you listen here," Harrison blustered, taking an aggressive step forward. Bear, who had been silent until now, shifted his weight. It was a small movement, but the ground seemed to vibrate with it. He didn't speak. He just looked at Harrison, his expression not angry, but profoundly disappointed, as if looking at something broken and foul. The unspoken message was clear: do not take another step. Harrison froze, his bravado evaporating in the face of that silent, immovable mass. Within 10 minutes, the blue and red lights of a patrol car were painting strobing patterns across the wet asphalt. A single officer got out. A woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense set to her jaw. Her name tag read Harding. She took in the scene with a practiced, weary glance. The nervous, well-dressed man, the terrified-looking teenage girl, the circle of imposing bikers. Her initial assumption was written all over her face. A runaway kid had fallen in with a bad crowd. "All right, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice clipped. Harrison immediately seized the opportunity, his relief palpable. "Officer, thank God, this is my student Maya," she ran off. "I'm her guidance counselor, Mr. Harrison. I was just trying to get her home safely, and these men—" He gestured vaguely at the wardens, letting the implication hang in the air. Detective Harding turned to Cutter. "And who are you?" "We're citizens who stopped to help a young woman in distress. Cutter said evenly. He did not offer his name or the clubs. He kept it simple, factual. Harding sighed, clearly wanting this to be a simple matter she could resolve quickly. She turned to Maya, her tone softening slightly, but still laced with skepticism. "Okay, honey, what's your side of it?" Maya flinched at the term honey, the same word Harrison had used, but she looked at Cutter, who gave her a barely perceptible nod of encouragement. She took a deep breath. "He's been following me. He won't leave me alone. And he stole my journal from my locker. It's in his briefcase in his car." She repeated the words, her voice gaining strength. The specificity of her claim was her only weapon. Harding's eyes narrowed slightly. It was the detail about the journal that caught her. It was concrete. It was verifiable. She turned back to Harrison. "Sir, the young lady is making a specific accusation. She says you have her property in your vehicle. Would you consent to a search of your car?" Harrison's face tightened. "Absolutely not. That's my private property, and the briefcase contains confidential student files. I can't allow you to look through it without a warrant. It would be a violation of school policy and student privacy." He was hiding behind the very rules he had twisted for his own purposes. Harding stared at him for a long moment. His refusal was a blaring red flag. A truly innocent person, a genuinely concerned educator, would be eager to clear their name. He was doing the opposite. Ghost stepped forward quietly. "Detective," he said respectfully, "you have a credible statement from a minor alleging theft. The alleged stolen property is contained in a mobile vehicle, which presents exigent circumstances. You have more than enough for probable cause to search the vehicle and the briefcase she specifically identified. I'm sure a judge would agree." He wasn't aggressive, but his calm recitation of legal doctrine was more powerful than any threat. Harding's eyes flickered from Ghost's intelligent face to Harrison's increasingly panicked one. She had been a cop for 20 years. She knew the smell of a lie. She made her decision. "Mr. Harrison, you can either open the car, or you can wait here while I get a warrant, at which point I will be searching it anyway. Your choice." Defeated, Harrison slowly walked to his car and unlocked it. Harding retrieved the leather briefcase from the passenger seat. She placed it on the hood of her patrol car and opened the clasps. On top of a stack of files was a cheap, spiral-bound notebook with a faded floral cover. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Harding opened it. The first page read, "Property of Maya Vance. Private." She flipped through a few more pages, her expression growing grimmer with every line of Maya's looping, desperate handwriting she scanned. Then she looked underneath the journal. Tucked at the bottom of the briefcase were 3 other notebooks, all of a similar style. She opened the top one. It belonged to a girl named Sarah Jenkins. Harding recognized the name. Sarah had been a student at Northwood who had abruptly moved out of state with her family the previous year. Rumor was she'd had some kind of breakdown. Harding looked up from the briefcase, her gaze as cold and hard as steel. She looked past Maya, past the bikers, and settled on Mr. Harrison. The weary skepticism was gone, replaced by a focused, righteous anger. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you're under arrest." The arrest of a beloved educator sent a shockwave through the quiet town of Northwood. The initial report in the local paper was sparse on details, citing an ongoing investigation, but the charge was clear: theft of private property from a minor. For the first few days, the community's reaction was one of stunned disbelief. Mr. Harrison, the man who organized the annual charity food drive, the counselor who stayed late to help students with their college applications? It seemed impossible. The prevailing narrative, whispered in grocery store aisles and on social media, was that the girl must be a troubled, attention-seeking foster kid. And those bikers she was with? They had clearly manipulated her. The school administration, caught completely off guard, went into immediate damage control. The principal issued a statement expressing shock and reaffirming the school's commitment to student safety, while placing Mr. Harrison on administrative leave. It was a carefully worded piece of corporate speak that said nothing while trying to placate everyone. They were hoping the problem would quietly disappear. It didn't. The wardens made sure of it. They didn't make public statements or grant interviews. Their action was quieter, more profound. They established a silent, rotating watch on Maya's foster home. A single, gleaming motorcycle would be parked down the street at all hours. A constant, unobtrusive presence. It was a message to anyone who might harbor ill will toward the girl who dared to speak up. It was also a promise to Maya. You are not alone anymore. Their quiet vigil did not go unnoticed. At first, it made the neighbors nervous. But when a local reporter tried to question Bear, who was on watch one afternoon, the big man simply said, "We're just making sure the neighborhood is safe." His calm demeanor and the simple truth of his words began to shift public perception. The real turning point came at the first school board meeting following the arrest. The room was packed with concerned parents, teachers, and a handful of reporters. The board president tried to steer the meeting toward budgetary matters, but a woman stood up, the mother of a girl who had graduated 2 years prior. "My daughter had Mr. Harrison as a counselor," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He used to text her at all hours. He told her she was special. When I complained, the principal told me he was just a dedicated teacher and that I was overreacting. My daughter started having panic attacks. We ended up pulling her out of the school." Another parent stood up, and then another. A pattern began to emerge, a history of behavior that had been ignored, dismissed, or explained away. The stories were all variations on a theme: inappropriate attention, isolation of vulnerable students, a cultivation of dependency that crossed every professional boundary. The journals Detective Harding had found were not an anomaly. They were the culmination of years of unchecked grooming. The wardens were there, sitting in the back 2 rows of the auditorium. They wore clean jeans and plain black t-shirts, their leather vests left on their bikes. They didn't speak. They simply sat and listened, their presence a silent, solid block of support for every person who stood up to share their story. They were a physical representation of the accountability that had been missing for so long. The news that there were other journals, belonging to other girls, finally broke in a follow-up article. The names were not released, but the existence of more victims shattered the narrative of the single, troubled accuser. Detective Harding, now leading a full-blown investigation, began re-interviewing former students who had left Northwood High under mysterious circumstances. The trickle of stories became a flood. Public opinion, once firmly on Harrison's side, began to turn, slowly at first, then with the force of a breaking dam. A group of students organized a walkout, marching from the high school to the town square, carrying signs that read, "We believe Maya," and "Protect your students." The community was no longer just watching, it was participating. The reckoning had begun. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but thanks to the mountain of evidence, they turned inexorably toward a conviction. The pretrial period was an agonizing ordeal for Maya. Harrison's expensive defense attorney employed a classic strategy: discredit the victim. He filed motions to have Maya's school disciplinary records and psychological history unsealed, attempting to paint her as an unstable and vindictive teenager with a history of disciplinary issues. Issues that Harrison himself had been responsible for documenting. It was a cruel, calculated attack on her credibility. This was where Ghost became Maya's quiet champion. With Cutter's blessing, He took a leave of absence from his job to act as a consultant for the public prosecutor assigned to the case. He wasn't her lawyer, but he was her guide through the bewildering legal maze. He met with her and the prosecutor, not to coach her testimony, but to prepare her for the process. He explained the purpose of cross-examination, the tactics the defense would use. "They will try to make you angry or confused," he told her, his voice calm and steady. "They want the jury to see an emotional, unreliable girl. All you have to do is stay calm and tell your truth, just your truth, nothing more." The warden's support was unwavering. On the first day of the trial, as Maya walked up the courthouse steps, flanked by her foster mother and a social worker, she was met with a gauntlet of news cameras and reporters shouting questions. Her heart hammered in her chest. Then she saw them. Across the street, lined up in a silent, orderly row, were the wardens. They weren't there to intimidate. They were there to bear witness. Cutter caught her eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all she needed. She lifted her chin and walked into the building. They filled the back rows of the courtroom every single day. Their presence was a quiet, powerful statement. When Harrison's lawyer tried to portray them as a menacing biker gang that had coerced Maya, the prosecutor simply asked Detective Harding on the stand, "In your interactions with these men, did they ever behave in a threatening manner?" "No," Harding replied crisply. "They were respectful, cooperative, and solely concerned with the child's safety. Frankly, they behaved more professionally than the suspect." The trial's centerpiece was the journals. The prosecutor had an expert in forensic psychology testify about the classic patterns of grooming behavior detailed in the girl's own words. Harrison's carefully constructed defenses, that he was just a concerned mentor, crumbled under the weight of the written evidence. The entries detailed his escalating possessiveness, his manipulation, his violations of their trust. Then it was Maya's turn to testify. As she walked to the stand, her legs felt like water. She could feel Harrison's eyes on her, cold and full of hate. She sat down, took a deep breath, and found Cutter's face in the back of the room. He was just watching, his expression unreadable but solid. She remembered Ghost's words, "Just your truth." Harrison's lawyer was brutal. He twisted her words, questioned her memory, brought up her parents' death, her struggles in the foster system. He tried to make her cry. He tried to make her angry. But with every question she returned to the simple, unshakable facts. "He told me not to tell anyone about our meetings. He took my journal from my locker. He followed me." She never wavered. Her quiet, steady testimony was more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man who had watched Maya with kind eyes throughout her testimony. He cleared his throat and read the verdict. "On the charge of felony theft, we the jury find the defendant, Mark Harrison, guilty. On the charge of stalking, guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, guilty." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Maya felt the tension leave her body in a single, shuddering wave. She didn't cry. She just felt a profound, quiet relief. Across the room, Detective Harding gave her a small, tight smile of victory. In the back row, the wardens sat perfectly still, their duty done. Justice, for once, had been delivered. The guilty verdict was not an ending, but a beginning. The conviction of a man who had hidden in plain sight for years forced the town of Northwood and its school district into a painful but necessary period of self-examination. The community had been complicit in its silence, too willing to believe the polished exterior of a predator over the quiet fears of vulnerable children. Now, they were determined to make amends. The school board, facing immense public pressure and the threat of multiple civil lawsuits, acted swiftly. They commissioned an independent investigation into the district's policies and personnel. The report that followed was a scathing indictment of systemic failure, detailing years of ignored warnings and a culture that prioritized reputation over student welfare. The principal who had dismissed parents' concerns was forced to resign. From the ashes of this crisis, real change began to grow. The most significant development was the unanimous passing of a new district-wide policy package, which students and parents unofficially dubbed the Maya Rules. This new code of conduct was concrete and unambiguous. It mandated that all one-on-one meetings between staff and students take place in rooms with interior windows or with doors left open. It strictly prohibited any staff-student communication on private text or social media channels. It also established a clear, third-party, anonymous reporting system, so students could voice concerns without fear of retaliation or dismissal. Detective Harding, promoted to sergeant, used the case as a training model for law enforcement agencies across the state, focusing on the importance of recognizing specific details in initial reports from minors and the subtle signs of grooming behavior. She emphasized the critical lesson from her first encounter with Maya. Listen to the specifics. The truth is in the details. The wardens, once viewed with suspicion, became unlikely local heroes. They shied away from the media attention, but their actions had spoken louder than any interview could. They channeled the newfound community respect into something constructive. Using funds raised by grateful parents, they established a youth outreach program, partnering with a local community center. Bear started a free workshop teaching basic auto mechanics to teenagers. Ghost offered pro bono legal clinics for families navigating the foster care system. Cutter, drawing on his leadership experience, mentored at-risk youth, teaching them the values of discipline, honor, and self-respect. They were no longer just a motorcycle club. They were an integral part of the town's immune system. Maya, shielded from the media circus by the wardens and a new, fiercely protective foster family they had helped vet, began the slow process of healing. The verdict had not erased her trauma, but it had validated her truth, and that made all the difference. She found her voice again, not just in the pages of a new journal, but in speaking to other young people in the foster system. She became an advocate, a quiet but powerful force for change, ensuring that other children would not have to face their monsters alone. The ripple effects of her one act of courage, of running toward a group of strangers in the rain, were transforming the world around her, making it a little safer, a little kinder, a place where children's voices could no longer be ignored. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly kept lawn of the warden's clubhouse. It wasn't the dark, intimidating den of stereotypes, but a converted barn on a few acres of land, with a sprawling vegetable garden out back, and the clean metallic scent of oil and polish hanging in the air from the attached workshop. The sound of laughter and classic rock music drifted on the autumn breeze. They were having a small barbecue, a celebration of nothing in particular, which made it all the more special. Maya, now 18, sat on the porch steps, a new sketchbook open on her lap. She was no longer the haunted, terrified girl who had stumbled into the gas station light. Her eyes were clear, her posture relaxed. She was still quiet, but it was a comfortable, confident quiet now, not a fearful one. She was on the cusp of a new life, with a scholarship to the state university where she planned to study social work. Her acceptance letter was pinned to the corkboard in her bedroom. She sketched with practiced ease, her pencil flying across the page. She wasn't drawing people or faces. She was drawing a landscape. It was a long, winding road disappearing into a set of rolling hills. But what made the drawing unique was what lined the road. On both sides, instead of fences or guardrails, stood a line of immense, powerful trees, their branches reaching over the road to form a protective canopy. Their roots were drawn with thick, dark lines, dug deep into the earth, unshakable. It was a road you could travel without fear. When she was finished, she tore the page carefully from the sketchbook and walked over to where Cutter was standing by the grill, flipping burgers. He looked over at her, and his weathered face broke into a rare, gentle smile. "Something for me?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She just nodded, suddenly shy, and handed him the drawing. He took it carefully, his calloused hand surprisingly delicate. He studied it for a long moment, his eyes tracing the lines of the road and the strong, guardian trees. He understood immediately. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw profound paternal pride that warmed her more than the autumn sun. "It's a good map," he said softly. "A good road to be on." He wiped his hands on a towel, and with the drawing held carefully, he walked inside the clubhouse. Maya followed him. Inside, the main room was warm and lived in, with comfortable old couches and shelves filled with books and trophies. One entire wall was covered by a large corkboard, a mosaic of the club's life. Photos of members with their families, birth announcements, newspaper clippings of charity runs, commendations from local groups. Cutter took a thumbtack and carefully pinned Maya's drawing right in the center of the board. It hung there, a quiet testament in charcoal and paper, surrounded by the faces of the men who had become her family. It was a picture of safety, a promise made and a promise kept. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the hills, the sound of powerful engines rumbled to life. Maya stood on the porch, waving as the wardens mounted their bikes to escort one of their members home. They rode out in a tight, disciplined formation, their headlights cutting a path through the gathering twilight. She watched them until their taillights were just a string of receding red stars. They weren't riding off into a mythic sunset. They were just riding, a constant, steady presence on the roads of a world that was, because of them, just a little bit safer. Maya turned and went back inside the warm, lighted clubhouse, closing the door on the darkness, finally and truly home.